All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're very pleased tonight to have our former Victorian member, is that the word, David? Group Captain David Fredericks, and David will be, he's now enjoying the sun-burning rays of Queensland, I believe.
The Gold Coast, yeah.
The Gold Coast, get a big hat, David, otherwise you'll end up like me. And his subject tonight is fascinating finds in researching the multicultural journey of the Air Force. And David has strong thoughts about putting together a book in the short term on that very subject. So from that point of view, David, handing over, you have control.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just checking, can everyone hear me well?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. Before I start, I'd just like to take a moment to pay my respects to the Yagamba people, who are the First Nations people here on the Gold Coast, and want to pay the respects to their past, present and emerging people. Also like to pay respects to any First Nations people here, either in the room or online tonight, and also to all the First Nations people in the areas where people are zooming in from. So tonight I'm going to do a presentation on the topic of the fascinating research I've uncovered while researching this topic about today's multicultural Air Force. People say to me, why this topic? I'm hoping to get a book out of it, but at this point in time, it's something that's just fascinated me through my recent Air Force career. And so you'll see that photo there at the moment. Let me just move those people to the side there. This was taken at Avalon at the start of the year. And there I am in the pajamas, the blue pajamas in the middle, and I've got 3 of my escort officers. I had to look after 60 escort officers during the course of my 13 days in Melbourne. And over probably 60% of them were born outside of Australia. Now, that, as you'll see there, where they've come from, we've got groups there born in Mongolia, Korea, and Singapore. There were other escort officers born in China, South Africa, all around the world. And of course, there's moi. They were all Australian citizens as a requirement to be in the Australian Defence Force. But it was really interesting because it made me start wondering about how there's been a huge explosion in a number of people who are members of the Royal Australian Air Force who bring a wealth of multicultural background. So I started thinking, is this a recent phenomenon? And my first port of call was to look back to 1981. And I know we've got Jenny Fantini there, and she'll probably be looking at all those 51 officers there, or sorry, cadets. And we were all called Sprogs because we're all first years back in those days. That was at RAAF Frognal in Camberwell. All that is remaining there these days is that beautiful white building. The RAAF base is no longer there. That was the course that I was on when I joined the Air Force 43 years ago. Doesn't hurt when you say it quickly. A bit more of a close-up of those people. Now, there is the mix of people. When I sat back and went, where are their ancestors come from? And you'll see there's Spanish, Greek, Russian, Swedish, Hungarian, New Zealand, which I understand on the current debate might become part of Australia again, Malta, Poland, Germany, and me right there in the middle. Yes, Jenny, you did leave scars on me after all those years. So I looked at that and went, well, we had an interesting mix back then, but there's no Asiatic, there's no Indian, etc. And we have a large number of those in the Air Force today. So I started going, well, how far can I trace this back? What is the roots of when the Royal Australian Air Force started to change? So if I look at it from the perspective of Australia's journey to being today's multicultural country, we can look at the fact that in 1901 we had federation, and then was the White Australia policy came with that. Now, 1966 was probably the first real major change when it came to it, with the abolition of the White Australia policy. I found it interesting that I was born 3 years before that occurred. So I'm probably in one of those groups of people who joined the Air Force, who transitioned, who were born and pre the abolition of the White Australia policy, and then ended up serving in the Air Force. Did that have an influence about the change? We also had the multicultural policy that was brought in 1973. Now, today in the Air Force, even though multicultural is still used, they're using the term CALD, C-A-L-D, meaning culturally and linguistically diverse. And in a number of ways, that sort of recognizes the fact that to be multicultural doesn't have that feeling of it's just the Asiatic. It's, Americans can be part of the CALD phenomena. New Zealand, people that bring different cultures as well as different languages. So I then said, well, did the RAAF have a parallel journey to get to this point? Now, during my pouring through Trove to find information, I found this reference from the Lochlander and Condobolin and Western Districts Recorder from the 27th of January 1941. I found this on Trove. And it lists there the qualifications for entry into the RAAF in 1941. I'll pick out the bit that's the most interesting for what I was researching. An applicant for enlistment must, as a rule, be a British-born or a naturalised British subject of pure European descent. Now, the rest of it goes into all the things about technical qualifications, etc. But those words were such, and I'd found this reference in a number of newspapers. So it was obviously supplied by the government, by Air Force, by Defence in the day, that you had to be either British-born or a naturalised British subject of pure European descent. So that then got me looking as to who did we have in the service, in the Air Force during World War II, and did they fit that criteria? Now, what I'm hoping tonight is to show you a few of the examples I found during the course of doing my research for what potentially will be this book that don't fit that model. I should say the book, if it does get published, it'll be made up of stories of both current and past members of the Air Force. So we have Despina Travandalis in the audience tonight, and she has her story coming to Australia. I want to make sure it's to show that the Air Force is a melting pot and we're stronger for all the things that we all bring. I have had people already make comment that this is a divisive book, as they do with the First Nations issue. But I'm hoping that by reading it, you'll see that by having such a diverse organisation, we're actually so much more stronger, both as a service and as a country. So let me get on to some of the things I found. There is a mix of some of the faces I found during the course of this research. And some of those I'm going to go into detail tonight. I will point out the one down there in the bottom right corner, listed as coming from Germany. He was an Air Vice Marshal, and he was raised in Germany before the war and lived in Germany during the war and used to see the bombers flying overhead. And he reached the heady ranks of Air Vice Marshal in the RAAF. So let me move on then. I'm going to talk about these four people here tonight. Victor Vort Ronald, Armand Etienne, and I will tell you that Armand Etienne has just basically taken over my life. And when I go into his story, you'll see why. I'm writing a book just on Armand himself. So if I go a bit long about Armand, you know why. John Dodorico and Oleg Bondarenko, all good Aussie British names. So let me start with Victor Vort Ronald. So, and I should say, the information I've got on a lot of these people has come from many sources, the NAA, their own PERS files, doing research, poring over books. I've actually made contact with relatives of some of these people who have been able to confirm information or go, wow, we didn't know that about great-granddad. So Victor Vort Ronald, he actually enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces in April of 1915. Had a regimental number. His date of birth, now from his AIF enlistment paperwork in 1915, it was down as May 1884. There was no actual day given. And he was listed as place of birth, Petrograd, Russia. To the question of nationality, he just left it blank. So one can only assume he had been Russian at some point. Had he become an Australian? Oh, sorry, a British subject? I cannot find any evidence to that extent. So he embarked for Europe in August 1916. He served with the 10th Battalion RAAF. His last 12 months was spent with the Australian Army Pay Corps in London, and apparently he did a really, really great job. He'd spent 633 days overseas, and he reached the rank of acting sergeant at the end. Unfortunately, he had fibrosis of the lungs. He was returned to Australia in March 1918, and on his return, he was discharged as an invalid. Interestingly, and this is where, again, when you open up some of these records and go, I can't believe what I'm just reading, he had said that he may have picked up the fibrosis while he was serving in the Russo-Japanese War as an interpreter. I have no way have I been able to find out whether that's true or not. I have no intention of going to Russia and going through their records, at least not at the moment. So I take it on at face value that may be true. What was interesting is, having got out in 1918 and been discharged as an invalid, he managed to re-enlist in the Australian Air Corps on the 1st of July 1920 down at Laverton. So basically the Army, the precursor to the Australian Air Force and then the Royal Australian Air Force. And he continued to serve with the AAC for 275 days until it was disbanded on the 30th of March 1921, being the day before the Australian Air Force was founded. So he basically they were all discharged on that day, then they re-enlisted the following day. Which he did. He re-enlisted in the Australian Air Force. Amazingly, he has service number 9. And so we're already taking the story that he was Russian. He was born in Russia. He served with the Russian military as an interpreter. And here he is in the Australian Air Force. His mustering was a clerk. Because of his previous experience, they brought him across as a flight sergeant. Here's where it all starts getting strange, and why I sort of, whether it's true or not about him being in the Russo-Japanese War. Because at this point, he's now saying he was born on the 28th of March, 1885. He's giving his place of birth as Brisson in France, and he's recorded the fact that he's a British subject by naturalisation, which he may have done in those years. Where it gets conflicting is, from his AIF enlistment paperwork, he's now a year younger. He's now coming from another part of Europe. And to make it matters worse, Brisson in France doesn't actually exist. I have found a place called Saint-Brisson, but there is no place called Brisson. So again, which of those do we take to be true? Anyway, he's continued on his services in the AIF. He's been put in charge of the stores office, firstly at the Central Flying School at Laverton, and then to number 1 Flying Training School. He manages to get himself promoted to Warrant Officer Class 1, and while it's 1 FTS, he gets designated as the Acting Unit Sergeant Major. Now, he only managed to serve in the AAF for 83 days. He didn't actually manage to last to the point where they became the Royal Australian Air Force, which occurred in August. The problem he had was that the Airborne Agenda 61 that came out on the 12th of April 1921 had these 2 requirements in it. One, and it noted that any airman who had joined the AAC, which he had been taken on without any medical examination because they were the best trained available men at the time, which explains how he got into the AAC, even though he'd been an invalid. However, the regulation required that this new Air Force was going to have everyone had to be passed as fit for general service on attestation. So he'd come in, he managed to hang around because they needed him, as well as 20 other airmen. So he was one of 20 who, because of this clause, this regulation, were effectively required to discharge from the AIF, which he did on the 21st of June, 1921. But he was obviously highly well respected. Now, these documents you see here, this is a letter that I've managed to get from the great-grandson, Mr. Michael Vaught Ronald, which is from the OC of the RAAF station at Laverton to Victor Fort Ronald in the month after he got out. Now, I will take you to the next page. Here is the transcript of what is said there. Basically saying they're very sorry he took his discharge, but the important thing is the squadron leader is noting, you were chiefly responsible for the successful installation of the new system of accounting for stores on the station. And then it goes on and says that, he can use this as a reference, etc. So he obviously left a mark. So we've got a guy here who is either French or Russian who's come in and he has left a mark in barely 83 days, his time in the Australian Air Force. The sad part to the story, he died on the 8th of January 1927. He'd made his way, obviously, at some point across to Adelaide. His body was found floating 3 days later in the Torrens River. The post-mortem conclusion was death by drowning, possible suicide. He'd been reported missing by his wife. I found some newspaper articles that said there may have been disputes, etc., but nothing was followed up. So it just leaves me with these questions. Was he Russian? Was he French? Did he actually serve in the Russo-Japanese War? And was he ever naturalised as a British subject? Given everything else he seemed to have stretched the truth about through all his time, did he actually get naturalised? I've been able to find no proof of that matter. So there's the first of the interesting stories. Now, I will now go on to my favourite gentleman, Mr. Armand Etienne. And as I said, this gentleman here he's possessed my life at the moment. I've managed to find a vein of documents at the Swiss archives, 11 separate files that have got thousands of pages each. And thankfully, I'm a French speaker and reader. 15% of them are written in French. About 80% are in German. So I'm busily trying to learn German now to help me actually get a good, clear translation of them all. Anyway, Armand was born in Odessa, Russia. Again, another one coming from the nation. In the 15th of September 1918. His father was Swiss, his mother was British. From what I've been able to work out, it seems that his father was over in Odessa as a teacher, teaching in a school, but I'm still trying to get evidence to that extent. They moved back into Switzerland, date unknown, and he was raised in a small township called Morges, which is near Lausanne. He finished his schooling and he obtained a diploma in agriculture from the local agricultural school there. Now, in Switzerland, everyone is required to do compulsory military service. In 1938, 1939, the records show that he spent 9 months doing his first group of compulsory military service. And he served in the Swiss Army Mountain Infantry Company, and he reached the rank of corporal. But that wasn't his love. He wanted to be on the ground, on the land, and doing stuff to do with agriculture. So I find a record that between February and March 1940, he travelled by ship from Genoa, Italy to Fremantle. Now, this was before Italy had joined the war. So he'd obviously come down from Lausanne through Italy and managed to get on board this ship. And he was one of 320 on board, most of whom were Italian migrants moving to Australia. He had listed his nationality as Swiss. He declared his employment to be an agronomist. And he put down his address, his planned residence as Quobba Station in Carnarvon in Western Australia. Now, it doesn't appear that he lasted there very long, and I'm trying to find out when he returned back from Carnarvon down to Perth, because by early 1941, he's starting to appear in newspaper articles across in the West, which I found through Trove. He was offering to teach French and German to anyone who wanted to, and he doesn't actually say whether he was charging people for it or not. I assume he was. He appears as performing in a number of local plays, and he was known as the buoyant Frenchman. One report actually said that he said he was a Frenchman waiting to join up with the Free French to go and serve. So straight away, he's changed his nationality from Swiss to French. Whether that was just a mistake by the reporters, I don't know. But then on the 29th of September 1941, he decides to go into the Perth Recruiting Centre and applies to enlist in the RAAF Reserves. He, at this point, gives his nationality as Swiss, and in the paperwork, he swears an oath to truly serve His Majesty King George VI, his heirs and successors. What I have found around this time is, amongst all the dossier of files, is there was a letter he wrote to his parents just before then, and he declares the fact that he wanted to be a patriot and he was going to serve the country that his mother was born in, Britain. So again, there's a sense there that he had this national pride towards Britain. He said that he loved Australia and he wanted to serve this new country that he'd grown in love with. Come the 7th of December 1941, infamous in history for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he then goes back to the recruiting centre, and this time he now enlists as an aircrew trainee. He puts a note there, he's got 10 hours of gliding experience, which I haven't been able to substantiate. But now he's listing, or it has written that he is a British subject. I found no evidence that he was naturalised prior to that. And what I'm assuming is potentially he may have claimed his mother's nationality, and given the state the Air Force may have been looking for people, they've accepted him. So between December 41, October 42, he goes through his flying training all in the West. Firstly at 9 EFTS on Tiger Moths, and then at 4 SFTS at Geraldton on Ansons. By October 42, he gets his wings and he gets commissioned as a pilot officer. Quickly, he's sent across to the other side of Australia. He's been selected to go and do maritime and to fly seaplanes. And so he goes to 3 OTU, Operational Training Unit at RAAF Mines, and he does a conversion onto Kingfishers and Catalinas. And while he's there, he's promoted to flying officer. Amongst all that, he manages to get to Melbourne somehow, and he gets married in April to a young lass, Nancy McCall. And barely 9 months later, their daughter is born. By July, he's posted to number 43 Squadron to fly Catalinas, and he remains there throughout the war till May 1945. They were initially located at Bowen in Queensland, but they had relocated to Darwin NT a few months after his arrival there. By October 44, he'd flown 790 hours operationally across 46 separate missions. Noting how long the Catalina missions were each, that's quite amazing. And that includes 466 hours and 31 sorties as the aircraft captain. Now, the photo you're seeing across there on the right shows Etienne, a stage photo. This is in the War Memorial Archives. This is celebrating the crew that received a DFC where he received a DFC for a mission where he was captain on the night of the 23rd and 24th of October, 1944. So I'll let you have a look at this mission. This is the transcript of the DFC. A Catalina from 42 Squadron had gone up to near Celebes and was basically brought down by anti-aircraft fire. Etienne from 43 Squadron and his crew were dispatched to do a rescue. They flew 895 miles into enemy territory in daylight, landed in the open sea. It was within sight of one enemy radar station and 4 active enemy airstrips that were less than 65 and 33 miles away, respectively. They landed, and this photo was taken by a USAF Catalina that was flying over the top, providing air cover. They have basically had the crews in these dinghies transferred from one to the other. He then flew the rescue flight back with the saved crew from the 42 Squadron aircraft. The overall flight time was 17 hours, and they flew 1,800 miles, which is recorded as the longest air-sea rescue by the RAAF during World War II. And for that, he was given the DFC. So, November 44, he gets promoted. May 45, he gets a posting to number 2 Flying Boat Repair Depot. And tasks include ferrying Catalinas new and old between San Diego and Australia, which he seemed to enjoy by looking at some of the records. I'm trying to find any information about what they might have got up to in San Diego, because Etienne seemed to be having a bit of a free spirit in his life. Come February 46, he signed on to stay in the interim Air Force post-World War II when the Air Force was massively downsizing, and he remained flying Catalinas. Unfortunately, as I said, he tended to have a bit of a life. He enjoyed life to the fullest. In June 46, he was court-martialed for neglecting to obey a general order. The facts behind the matter were that he was programmed to fly a Catalina test flight on the afternoon in Port Moresby. The aircraft had been re-rigged and had to do a rigging check. He'd had lunch at the Port Moresby Hotel before the test flight and bumped into two old friends of his. There were two RAAF officers and said, "Do you want to come along for a jolly?" Which they said yes. He then met three local female civil servants who are working up there in Port Moresby as part of the Australian government. And he asked them if they'd like to come along for the jolly as well. And they said yes. He got caught at the end of it. Someone had basically found these people getting off the aircraft post the test flight and was charged accordingly. He was found guilty. In those days, when you were punished or put up for a court martial, it was effectively marching the guilty bastard. So it was pretty much sure that he was going to be found guilty. He was reprimanded and he was given a loss of 6 months seniority at rank. His style, again, this comes through in one of his annual confidential reports. And I should point out for anyone who hasn't served, up until about 1987, all reporting on personnel was done confidential and it was called closed reporting. So the person being reported on never got to see what was written about them. It's only been since around 87, 88, we now have an open reporting system where people basically tell you and you get to see what was written. So what is written here was probably never seen by Armand. It said he was a French-Swiss citizen, officer. It says he was never naturalised as a British subject. Excitable, but it doesn't impair his efficiency. But he's lost his dash and drive he displayed during the war. What was very interesting here is he's popular with his fellow officers, but he understands very little of his responsibilities towards the men. So you would take that perhaps he didn't really get on with the NCOs, but he was liked by his officer comrades. Come February 47, he's elected to demobilise and he gets out of the RAAF in Sydney, where his wife was living and their young daughter. By July 47, though, he starts popping up again, now in the Dutch East Indies. This newspaper report from the Times suggested that he was flying with number 19 Squadron, NEI, so the Netherlands East Indies in Java, and being the first to re-enter combat conditions since the war, and it listed some other RAAF servicemen. From what I've been able to discover, he didn't actually join the Dutch East Indies Air Force. The Dutch East Indies, the NEI had been based at Archerfield. The Australian government was getting a bit nervous about having them in Australia because they were also operating into the Dutch East Indies, and there was basically combatant activities occurring against the Indonesians. And so the Australian government was keen to get the Dutch out of Australia. So one of the ways they did that was they were starting to recruit ex-RAAF officers, ex-RAAF pilots, and having them fly the aircraft under the guise as being civilian employees for KNILM. So he was flying up there in the Dutch East Indies. His wife and daughter managed to move up there. Unfortunately, by August 47, KNILM ceased operations and they were taken over by KLM. Now, at this point, there's a real twist to the story. As I mentioned before, the Swiss government doesn't permit its citizens to serve in foreign militaries without explicit Swiss government permission. So if you do your military service, if you're a Swiss national, you serve that country, and as they are neutrals, you're not permitted to go and serve anywhere else. Etienne decides, though, that given that he was such a patriot and he wanted to serve Australia, he actually goes and applies to the Swiss consul in Melbourne for permission. He states this is his new country. He's got a sense of patriotism. He says he's going to get naturalised, given his mother's British. The Swiss government comes back and he gets told formally, permission refused. But he goes and enlists anyway. So he's serving in the Air Force. The Swiss don't know anything about this. He thinks the world's okay and he's out there, he's flying for the Royal Australian Air Force. In January 43, however, just before, well, when he was engaged, before he got married, his future in-laws put a notice in the Argus newspaper in Melbourne declaring the engagement of their daughter to Pilot Officer Armand Andre Etienne. This copy here appears in the files from the Swiss archives because the Swiss consul staff spotted it, wrote back to the Swiss government officials and said, "We think we found one of our people serving here. What do you wish to do?" Over the next 18 months, basically the Swiss government put together a case and decided eventually in October 44 to hold a military tribunal against him for serving in a foreign military. And so he was basically going to be judged for not complying with Swiss law. Of course, he's in the RAAF. When the court martial was held, that was barely, or the tribunal, that was barely 2 weeks before he got his DFC. Through all the evidence, he was found guilty of serving in the RAAF without permission, and they gave him a punishment of 3 months jail sentence to be awarded, to be served when he returned to Switzerland at any point in time in the future. This is not unusual. I found other records amongst the Swiss archives. The Swiss had a lot of people trying to go and serve in other countries. And I found one record that was presented in Etienne's appeal to this later on that said they had to actually apply this rule because they had Swiss serving in Canada, Swiss serving in the USA, Swiss serving with the Germans, and some that actually had gone and served with the SS. So they were trying to be consistent in their application of this law. Etienne's still living in Java. He's still flying for KLM. Unfortunately, after this is all found out, the Swiss authorities in Batavia discover that he is flying in Batavia, and they get authority to put a constraint upon his passport, which they then tell him and say, you can only use your passport to fly back to Switzerland and to serve this punishment. So this is when this is all starting to come out that he realizes that he's in a bit of trouble here. So he negotiates with the Swiss officials and says, look, I need my passport to fly, but I'm planning to return home in 1948, so I'll solve it then. The Swiss were a bit lenient, but effectively it forced his hand and he had basically 12 months to get back to Switzerland. He gets back to Switzerland in 1949. He appeals his sentence and it's successful. You know, it's been after the war, 4 years on, and they've basically recognised his service with the Royal Australian Air Force and reduced his, still found guilty, but he's now found that he's got to serve 1 month, which is held as a suspended sentence for 2 years. He never serves that jail time. Shortly after, he goes and joins Swiss Air. And at various stages over the next 21 years, he's co-pilot and pilot on DC-3s, Convair 440s, DC-4s, DC-6s, 7s, 8s, and the CV-990. And across on the right here, this is again from his archives. This is one of the records of the aircraft and what Swiss Air were tracking of the aircraft types that he'd been carrying on and when. The sad part of Armand's story, and this was, I was flabbergasted when I found this. When I had his file opened up from the NAA, and across the front of it had a simple note, killed in air accident, Switzerland, 1970. That was the thing that triggered me to want to know more about this guy. So on the 21st of February, 1970, he was killed in the crash of Swiss Air SR-330 near Zurich. And this is the actual aircraft here. It was CV-990, a Coronado, HBICD. He was co-pilot. The flight route was Zurich to Tel Aviv, and then there was another leg on to Hong Kong in the following days. It had 9 crew and 38 passengers on board. As the aircraft was passing through 14,000 feet after takeoff, there was an explosion in the cargo hold in the rear. It was later found that was a PLO who had planted a terrorist bomb on board, a letter bomb. There was the interesting side story to this, that it was meant to have gone on to a Pan Am aircraft that was flying out of Tel Aviv. But because of a change in time, it was actually put onto the Swiss Air aircraft instead, loaded there, the mailbag. Anyway, after the explosion occurred, there's smoke in the cabin, loss of flight control. The crew wrestled it for about 16 minutes after takeoff. I have copies of the full transcript as well as the audio of all those 16 minutes, and it's terrible to listen to. 16 minutes after that, the crew lost control and it crashed vertically into the ground in a forest that's about 22 kilometers northwest of Zurich at a speed of 421 knots, they've estimated. throughout the whole thing, Etienne was quiet, but obviously the captain was doing all the air traffic comms, but you could hear Etienne in the background. He came on and said the second last thing, which was at 40 seconds before he hit the ground, and that was 330 is crashing. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye, everyone. And that's the end of Armand Etienne. That's the end of his story. His wife moved back to Australia. Unfortunately, she's been dead for a long period of time now. He has a son and daughter that I believe are in Switzerland, and I'm trying to track them down because I'd really love to get their first-hand story about their father. John Dodorico, okay, born 1922 in Trieste, Italy, Italian by birth. His parents brought him out to him and his brother. They came out to Australia in 1928 and they settled in Moe down there in eastern Victoria. Between 1937 and 1940, he did various things there. He was a dry cleaner, a lathe worker, a motor mechanic. Apparently, he was a bit of a scallywag around town because the local newspapers talk about him as being a lively chap. He had become naturalised as the British subject sometime before 1940 because he showed that he was shown as being naturalised as British subject in his enlistment papers, which on the 29th of January 1940 went enlisted in the RAAF at Laverton. And he first of all enlisted as a rigger or aircraft hand mustering in Aircraftman 1. In June 40, his first posting after training was to 3 Squadron at RAAF Richmond, where he was doing maintenance on the Hawker Demons. Not long after, though, 3 Squadron was sent to the Middle East, the first RAAF unit to go to the Middle East. So heading out by ship. He was to spend the best part of a year and a half with 3 Squadron in the Middle East, where he served as a fitter on Hurricanes, Tomahawks, and Kittyhawks. Where that's really quite interesting is that one of their major combatants that the squadron was fighting against were Italians. And he was of Italian ancestry and he'd only left there 12 years before. If you see this Hurricane down here on the bottom right, in the back, you'll see there's a wing that's of an Italian aircraft in a hangar. So it's interesting. Now, how was his thoughts being Italian? And here he is potentially having the pilots of his squadron fighting against what were his original countrymen. Anyway, 42, February to November 43, had numerous postings around Australia to 3 bags, 2 OTU, 4 OTU, 1 OTU. Again, a bit of a lively personality. He was charged at least 6 times during that period for many offences. And it's interesting to go through and try to find all the charge sheets and the various things he was charged for. But he must have had the gift of the gab or the ability to talk his way out of trouble, because somehow by 43, end of 43, he was selected for aircrew training, which he did over in South Australia. So he went to 1 EFTS and flew Tiger Moths, 6 SFTS at Malala Ansons. Then he somehow went straight to CFS at Point Cook to do flight instructor training before he'd actually gone out anywhere and done any actual operational flying. By the end of this, he was commissioned and promoted to flying officer. We have another Archerfield link here. He was posted to 38 Squadron. The war is coming to an end. So he's posted to 38 where they were flying C-47 Dakotas. And their focus at that time was principally to do post-World War II POW repatriation flights, which he did numerous flights of out of Thailand, Singapore, Borneo, New Guinea, and Rabaul. A quirk of fate was his elder brother was actually an Army POW in Borneo. He was not repatriated by John. He'd been brought back before John had started with the unit. But again, you know, that you've got that 2 brothers who, through a quirk of fate, may have met. He could have potentially repatriated his brother at some point. On the 12th of December 1945, he was married. But the day before he got married, he decided he better anglicise his name. His wife was an Anglo-Saxon by origin, and whether the Dodorico name didn't fit the parents of the bride is unknown, but he was now no longer John Dodorico, but John Dodorick. The war has come to an end, obviously, by this stage. In January 46, though, he decides he wishes to remain in the post-interim Air Force. So in September 46, he gets posted to a crew conversion unit fighter, to the crew conversion unit for fighters at Williamtown, where he did a conversion course on the Mustangs. He had hoped to be posted to a Mustang squadron, but there was actually some issues with the Mustangs at the time in Australia. And also Korea and the BCAAF was starting to have a demand that they needed more Dakota aircrew. So instead of going to a Mustang squadron at Williamtown, he was posted back to 38th Squadron, which by this stage was down in Schofields in New South Wales, just outside Sydney. At this point, he's now doing C-47 missions, flying to Japan and return for BCAAF support. As all Air Force people do, he started getting, by June 47, he started getting into postings that he probably didn't enjoy. So firstly, he was posted to a position which was called the Fire Controller Post in Port Moresby. He only lasted there barely 4 months. He was then posted to an air movements role at Darwin. Whether that was a catalyst for him seeing that he was now in ground jobs and he wasn't going to be doing any flying, unknown. But on the 17th of February 1948, he elected to be demobilised at Laverton. By 1950, he was now, similar to Armand Etienne, he joined KLM and he was flying DC-3s in the Dutch East Indies. Again, I bring the point, the fact that following the end of World War II, there was significant unrest that was occurring in the Dutch East Indies between the Dutch and Indonesians over their sovereignty and independence calls. That has ramifications for our hero here, John Doderick. On the 11th of May, 1950, he and some other pilots, friends of his from KLM, were supposedly driving through the streets of Jakarta in a car. He was shot dead by an Indonesian soldier. He managed to live 6 days, and his wife flew up there, and she managed to arrive there into his bedside 25 minutes before he passed away. But he died on the 17th of May, and then he was to be buried on the 25th of May. Lots was written about what happened following this event. And what was particularly interesting was the Australian government was up in arms about it. There was significant diplomatic issues occurring about an Australian being shot by an Indonesian soldier on the streets of Jakarta. An interesting quote then came from the Indonesian Foreign Affairs advisor that may give you an idea about what it would have been like to be in Jakarta in those times. And he said, "I am asking military authorities to be more insistent on warnings by soldiers when they are carrying arms. The shooting was most deplorable. However, Australia must understand that in Indonesia, we have 3 armies, each entitled to carry arms, and all are accustomed to shooting first before they are shot at. That is why Doderico was shot." So again, there was significant backlash to the Indonesian response, and it took a number of years for that to calm down. And part of that was linked to the demise of John Doderico. Now, here is a bizarre one. Oleg Bondarenko, born in Harbin, China, but his nationality was Russian because both his parents were what we would call white Russians. His father had been living in Harbin for a number of years, and Harbin was a bit of a center for Russians in China and had been working on the building and construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the townships that sprung up around the railway lines. He had completed his schooling in Harbin in 1925. Between 25 and 27, he attended a Russian military school at Sinafou in China, and he graduated with the rank of sub-lieutenant in the Russian army. The year later, by the end of 28, he completed his first year of a Russian aviation school, and he'd been promoted to lieutenant. Unfortunately, that course was discontinued because at the time, the Russian forces in North China were disbanded owing to the defeat of the North China forces by General Chiang Kai-shek in 1928. So effectively, the Russians were moving out of that area. And like many Russians at the time, Bondarenko and his family moved to Shanghai. I lose track of him at this point, but then he pops up again in January 1939. He's still in Shanghai, and by this time he's employed by the China Navigation Company, and he's doing a role on board shipping around the world as an anti-piracy guard. Between November and December 41, he gets on board a ship, the MV Yochao, which is traveling from Shanghai to Fremantle. He arrives in Fremantle in December 41. 2 months later, he's reporting to the recruiting centre in Perth asking to be enlisted. He gives his nationality as Russian. He tells them he speaks multitude of languages: Chinese, Polish, Russian, French, English. He passes all his trainee testing, and the interviewer's notes in his file say he's a good type, neat, gentlemanly manner, and obviously well-educated and intelligent. No sign of coloured extraction. That gives you a feel. Again, we talk about the White Australia policy, and there it is coming through. They're willing to take him so long as he hasn't got coloured extraction. The recruiting centre are a bit perplexed. They're not sure what to do, because the rules are that even though he is of European descent, he's not a British subject and had never been one. They contact the Director of RAAF Recruiting in Melbourne and provide the guidance, the following here, that says, it's been ascertained from the shipping agents that this man has been doing piracy duty at Shanghai. He was evacuated and given a job on a British-owned ship that is now in the port at Fremantle. There's no room for Bondarenko on the ship, and the agents state they would be glad if his services could be utilised in the RAAF. So kindly, here, go and join the Royal Australian Air Force. By March 42, he's in the RAAF Reserve. By July 42, he's now remustered to flight mechanic. And he had numerous postings across a number of schools. Went to number 4 School of Technical Training in Adelaide, 1 engineering school at Ascot Vale in Victoria, which I understand where the showgrounds are in Victoria now, in Melbourne. He went to 1 EFTS at Parafield and to an embarkation depot in Ascot Vale. He obviously had some significant medical issues, and I suspect there may have been mental health issues in there. I've discovered he had 7 instances of extended stays in hospitals, including the McLeod Sanatorium in Victoria. So come the 14th of October 43, he's discharged in Perth under Air Force Regulation 115N on the medically unfit for further service. But kindly, his discharge papers noted a very good character with moderate trade proficiency. He's still Russian at this time. He settles down, gets married in South Yarra in September 46, settles down in Lalor. This is how I know that he was still Russian, because in those days, if you wish to get naturalised as a British subject, you had to put an advert into a newspaper announcing your intent. He announced his intent. You'll see here at the top, this is taken from the Argus again, where he says that he wishes to pursue residency as a British subject. He puts his application in. In April 1950, ASIO make an assessment of his application and have decided that he is known to have strong communist leanings, and ASIO will furnish a full report in due course. These are taken from the ASIO files, which are existing in the NAA. The migration officials go back and say the ministers decided that they don't tell him about the comments about the communist leanings. They just say, we've decided to defer looking at this for another 12 months. So can you please reapply in July 1952? Which he does. He actually puts his application in February 52. He notes that he's employed as a reader at the government printing office in Melbourne, and he'd been so for 3 years. He says his nationality is stateless at this point in time. His argument being that he'd been born in China, he never ever lived in Russia, he'd never ever been to the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, which had now taken over Russia, and therefore, in theory, he had no state. So by early 53, the Department of Immigration make a second assessment into him. They accept his argument that he is stateless. They note that he hadn't come under any adverse police notice since his last report. And importantly, at this point, ASIO say the security objection no longer exists, and they recommend his application be approved, which come May 53, that's done. In May 53, a certificate of naturalisation is issued by the Department of Immigration. There's only one problem. He's died 2 months before. On the 31st of March 53, he died in Heidelberg in Victoria, 2 months before being naturalised. And importantly, he died stateless. They accepted he was stateless, and he was basically been living in Australia 12 years, and he'd spent 19 months in the Air Force. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just looking at the time now. I've got another 4 very short summaries of a couple of other people, if you're interested in hearing those, yes, or would you like to move on?
Go for it.
I go for it? Okay. Knut Gronberg. born in Sweden in 1900, was Swedish. He served in the Swedish Navy between 1914 and 1920. He joined as basically a sea cadet and ended up getting effectively going through the ranks, reaching the rank of equivalent of corporal, and was doing maritime duties at sea. He then went and did a whole series of work as a commercial shipping around the world after he got out of the Swedish Navy, and arrived in Australia in 1932. In 1939, he goes and gets naturalised and takes the name of Knut Greenhill, and goes and enlists in the RAAF as a fitter motorboat crew, and he did significant amounts of service in far north Queensland, Torres Strait, and Papua New Guinea. Another Frenchman, Jacques Foulligny. He was born in Lille, France in 1912, French, obviously. He did his period of conscription in the French army in 1932 at the age of 20. He'd moved to Australia, though. He was also a wool buyer for a French wool firm. And so by 1934, he'd moved to Australia and hadn't finished his period of conscription. So he's living in Sydney in Neutral Bay. He's married by this stage. The Japanese were at this point coming down, looking to take over Indochina. He basically gets called up to go and serve with the French army in Indochina, where he spends the best part of 14 months fighting against the Japanese for the French. The French capitulate, and so this is part of the whole Vichy French time as well. He returns to Australia and then decides to join the RAAF, firstly as a radar mechanic, as an NCO. He then eventually gets a commission as an administration and special duties officer, as a pole officer, so an admino, and he did service in the Northern Territory. I've found records of when he passed away in the 1970s, and there's no evidence he was ever naturalised at any stage during his life. So he serves as a Frenchman. This young chap up here, Stevan Fundak, born in Yugoslavia in 1924, one of 6 children. Yugoslavian, obviously. His parents came out here in 1932, and he followed. He enlisted in the RAAF as a general hand in 1942. He then, in 43, managed to get himself remustered to armament assistant, and he served in New Guinea with 100 Squadron for a good close on 2 years during the war. I've spoken to his younger sister, who's still alive and lives down here on the Gold Coast, and she says that when he returned from war and he was an used to load armaments onto these aircraft, he would wake in the middle of the night screaming and in tears, and what we would call PTSD today. And that was from the role he had on the ground. He did become naturalised in 1943, but he never actually applied for it. While he was off in New Guinea with 100 Squadron, his father had put an application in for himself and his 6 children to all become British subjects. His eldest daughter got rejected because anyone over the age of 20 had to apply for themselves. Fundak was under 20 at that serious time. So he was given naturalisation through his father's actions while he was up there in New Guinea, and he probably never knew anything about it. And the last one I have tonight is Roy Cooley. So as I said earlier on, culturally and linguistically diverse. I suppose an American would fit into being both culturally and linguistically different to Australians. Came from Des Moines, Iowa in 1917. He'd served as a US merchant marine on the east coast of the States between 30 and 38. By 1938, though, he'd managed to get his way to Gladstone in Queensland and was being employed locally by the Gladstone Electric Light Company as an electrical labourer. Come December 41, he applies and gets accepted into the Royal Australian Air Force, even though he's an American. I have found documents there saying that we'll take him. He says he will swear allegiance to the King and he will renounce any support from the American government, but he never actually says he's going to become a British subject. He says his reason for joining was he was a patriot. So he joins the RAAF and he spends the best part of just under 2 years in the Air Force as a mechanic NCO, and he served in the Southwest Pacific area. He was charged twice while he was up there, once for not wearing his hat on parade and the other time for not bothering to get out of bed in the morning. Again, no proof he was naturalized. And this comes through the fact that in December 43, he managed to get permission to resign from the Air Force and join the United States Army Air Force. There was about 8 pages of documents in his files that refer to the ongoing discussion, because he obviously decided well before November that he wanted to go and actually get a flying role. And he thought the best way of doing that was with the USAF. And he was writing to the USAF and to the Air Board asking for permission to transfer between one service and the other. They finally agreed, and there's documents there saying where the Americans would accept people who had been fighting, Americans who had been fighting in co-belligerent forces for other nations. So these documents show that they permitted him to go from one to the other. However, the RAAF wanted proof that before they let him resign, that there was someone going to be there from the USAF to make sure he didn't do a runner, that he would actually leave one and go and join the other on the same day. Anyway, he came across, he was eventually made as a tech sergeant, and he was employed, and he got his wish as a B-24 engineer gunner. Unfortunately, the aircraft he was flying on, and I found photos of it, the aircraft's called Sandy, 14th of October 44, was doing a mission over Borneo and was missing in action. And it was only in 1946 they decided they pronounced him as killed in action. No remains of him or any of the crew ever found. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's part of the wild ride I've been finding and researching some of the amazing stories of these people that have served in the Air Force. I hope you've found this fascinating, as I have. They're stories that they deserve to be told. And again, I come back to that point I made earlier on. This is not about trying to say, oh, you know, these people come from different nations, and no intention of being divisive. These are stories that make up the Air Force of today. And we should be proud that these people wanted to come and serve our nation in their various guises. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll stop the screen share there and open for questions.
I'll take questions in the room first of all.
Richard, you've got a question for David?
David, Richard Honus in Melbourne, you were mentioning Oleg going for a time into the McLeod Hospital. My father was at McLeod, but there were 3 hospitals at McLeod, all in close proximity. There was a mental hospital, a TB sanatorium called Gresswell TB sanatorium, that's where my father was, and there was a soldiers' hospital. Are you sure that he went to McLeod because of mental problems?
Oh, I cannot be positive on it because I obviously can't get access to his personal records from a health perspective, but the evidence from the other cases and where he was at the time in some of the other hospitals leans me. And that's why I sort of say I believe he may have gone for mental reasons, but I can't be definitive.
Larundel was the very large mental hospital in McLeod, and it existed for a lot of years. I think it only finally folded up in the 1960s, and currently it's being redeveloped as a big housing estate. He died, you said, in Heidelberg, and I presume that's at the repatriation hospital, which still exists there in Bell Street.
He may have, all the information I have is he died in Heidelberg. So whether he was living in Heidelberg at the time, and again, if anyone has any more information about these people or anything to challenge what I've just said, I would love to get it, because this is the fascinating research. I'm not saying it's complete, and I'm more than happy to add pieces to the jigsaw puzzle. Despina.
Anyone with another question from our audience here in Melbourne? And then we've got from someone from our Zoom category there.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, Despina. Yeah.
Yeah. The question I had was, in your research, did you find any rejects for acceptance into service with people of similar backgrounds? In other words, were they applying the rules or not applying the rules consistently, or was it whim of the day?
I have not come across anyone that's been rejected, but that may be for the case that their rejection files have not been put into the archives.
Oh, right.
So again, this is the problem that I'm going through the NAA files and I'm finding the people have served. I can't. The lack of evidence doesn't prove the case.
Yeah, okay.
I'll jump in. Wonderful talk, sir. That was absolutely brilliant. What was your most effective source of your research? Was it the National Archives? Was internal defence documents? How did you put these stories together?
National Archives is the ones that give me the taster. So I've been doing wildcard searches of the A9300 and the A9301 series, which are all the PERS files held in the archives. It's hard because obviously it stops post-World War II. So there's not, unless someone's actually had them digitized, but by going through there and then online and doing wildcard searches, so seeing if someone has the word Greece appear in their listing of the file name, and that could be, there's some names that pop up that are, I don't know, let me think of a name here at the moment. People with China, I find people who are born in China, but then I find that they're actually born to British subjects who are working in China. So it's been a lot of digging and then getting a list of files and then opening them up and then trying to explore, is there a story there? Quite often, the ones that I did tonight, you open them up and go, any file that's got more than 50 pages, it's worth having a look at. And when you get one that's got a couple of 100 pages, you're guaranteed you're going to hit gold. And I think a couple of those tonight were in that, this is gold. So Bondarenko, for someone who only served 19 months, had an awful lot in his file. So that's the primary, but that then leads you to various other sources. So if they were court-martialed or if there was something about ASIO there, going to try to get the ASIO file digitized. Armand Etienne was the one that said he's taken over my life, and finding this rich trove of information with the Swiss archives. There's Swiss newspaper archives similar to Trove. Unfortunately, they're all in German and French, so there's a lot of time spent reading those and checking I've got my verbs and nouns correct when I'm reading it. But yeah, and even going out there, I've been using various sources and finding people that are still alive. So as I mentioned, Fundak's got a relative alive here. I found a few. The Air Vice Marshal down the bottom there, his daughter is still alive and living in Brisbane, so I'm making contact with her. Vort Ronald was a complete fluke. I found it's such a rare name, and I just was going through and I found a Dr. Vort Ronald. And I just sent him a cold email and he came back and told me what his research was. Roy Cooley, who I just mentioned, I was just going through Ancestry and I put all the names into Ancestry and try to see if I can build a picture through Ancestry around them. But that also gives me names of people who are researching them. And so Roy Cooley's, I managed to track down someone in the States who was researching Roy Cooley, and who was completely unaware that Roy Cooley had been in the Royal Australian Air Force beforehand. And all he knew was he was a crew member with B-24s and went missing in Borneo.
Wow.
David Anderson in Melbourne. I've enjoyed your talk immensely. Now, I know nothing about this subject, but the question I'm going to ask you is, how many Aboriginal personnel were in the Royal Australian Air Force? Say during the Second World War, you hear occasionally about Aboriginal fighter pilots and so on. Are you covering that aspect as well?
No, I'm not, because that was done by another book in the Air Force that came out earlier last year, First Nations Aviators.
Well,
so
they also wouldn't be classed as British citizens.
No.
No, and again, because there has been a book written on the First Nations aviators and the First Nations members of the Air Force, I'm not covering them in this particular topic. So, I hope this book will go out and complement that one. We already have another book being written at the moment by a number of ladies, one of whom's online here tonight, Anna Williams, about the women who have served in the Royal Australian Air Force. So, we're trying to look at it from different perspectives. And so I don't want to touch on the First Nation side because it'll be duplicating what's already been done. This is looking for those who have come from overseas. Despina?
Just to answer the question about the First Nations people and their nationality, they were, having been heavily involved in the First Nations book, I can confirm that they were registering as British subjects.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if we have no one else asking.
Air Commodore Lax has got his hand up. Hello, sir.
No, you knew I was going to say something, didn't you? Well done, Fredo. Good story and a great book in the making. If you go to the World War I era historians website, you'll find there's two names on the database, the Vidian database, of over 5,000 Australians who served in World War I in various services. There's two that were German.
Oh, okay.
And one of them was a guy called Frauenfelder. And I don't recall the other one, but you might look on that database if you want something that goes back to that era.
That'd be good. That'd be great.
Yeah, Frauenfelder is the name that comes to mind. And I've just sent you a very short email about Bort Ronald. I've looked up the Citizens Air Force PORs, and according to them, he served from the very first day of the Air Force, 31st of March 21, until the 21st of June 21. And he listed his date of birth as the 28th of April 1884. So there's another date and another
date,
another thing. So a very short time in the Air Force as a very junior, and he was listed as a clerk.
Yes, yeah. And it's interesting, again, that letter that I got from his grandson that says, how he was respected for setting up their stores accounting system. So, we all look at Dickie Williams as being at the far of the Air Force, but here's this letter about the Equipo who was Russian or French.
And a little anecdote from my own personal experience too. I joined the Air Force at the beginning of 1974. And a year later, I got a letter from the personnel department asking about my nationality. So this was curious to me because I was born in the UK and I came out in the early 60s. And thank goodness my father and mother had decided to apply for naturalisation. But the Air Force had no record of this, even though, yes, when you join, you have to provide all that information. And I had to sign a statement that declared that I was an Australian and that I was not of any other nationality, including a British subject, which is very interesting, isn't it? 1975 it was then.
So I had the same situation. I was born in the UK, but parents, I was registered Australia House at birth, and I joined the Air Force in 81. And it was only in 1989 when I was receiving a posting to New Zealand. So I'd been in the Air Force 9 years of stage that they went, but we show you as being British. We don't have any proof of you have been naturalised. So I had to go and get a certificate of the naturalisation that says 1989, but it was from birth in 1963. So I'd managed to survive for 9 years before I got my letter.
And they still haven't kicked me out after all this time. Very good. No, good job, Fredo.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll just put out, if anyone has any other stories or information, please send it through to me. It's great. It's something to get my teeth into. It's a fascinating topic. I'm really, really enjoying it. I've got other things occurring in my life at the moment, and the family's that, and this is actually keeping me from going mad at home. So really, if you know a snippet about someone, please pass it on to me, and I'd really appreciate it. And particularly anything about Armand Etienne as well, okay?
Fredo, Peter Dunn. My father-in-law, Jan Gulovich, was born in Siberia. He got a DFC in 460 Squadron, and he's an ex-pilot of G for George. And his father, Basil Gulovich, who was probably born in Belarusia because they moved across to Siberia, where Jan Gurlovich was born, and then they moved to Shanghai, and then they came to Australia in 1924. So I'll send you some details.
Great. That's great, Peter. Always happy to have another entry for the book.
Well, any other
questions?
hands up at all? Any other comments there? David, would be keen to hear from you. No? Well, let me just say, David, thank you very much for a most enlightening and interesting topic tonight. You've put a lot of research into the presentation you've done tonight, and it just fascinates me from the point of view that we've had, as you say, foreign nationals serving in the RAAF, and I just think today you have to be Navy, Army, Air Force. You have to be of Australian nationality, or maybe British, or New Zealand. But that's the limit of it. If you said you were from Russia or China or somewhere else, I can hardly see you getting into the ADF these days unless you became an Australian national citizen. Interesting. Times change, and so do the rules, so to speak.
Sorry, just thought occurred to me now. Sorry, David. Roy Goon, do you cover Roy Goon?
Yeah, I've already got Roy Goon's story, but because everyone knows Roy Goon's story, I decided not to tell it tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, David, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. Fascinating. I'm sure that all of our people here and on Zoom look forward to your book. And if they've got any other information on people that they know of that David would be interested in, if you don't have his details, we can certainly pass them on to you to make contact with David. Fascinating subject, and the stories that he has expanded on tonight. And I just look at all that and think, wow, a lot of research has been done here, and a lot of fascinating stories on the post World War I into the World War II and beyond that as well. So from that point of view, thank you very much, David. Do appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everyone.